Each of these stages is another link in the evolutionary chain which stretches back to the origins of all life forms on Earth.
Hello, my name is Mohammed Noor, and I'm an evolutionary biologist at Duke University. Today I'd like to talk with you about the origin of species and evolution more generally, as depicted in the various Star Trek TV series. So let's go ahead and get started. I'll make my image go away. The running theme for this talk will be knowing biology. What could life in outer space be like, and how does that match what we see in the Star Trek TV series? I should stress that in this talk, I'll be referring to the original series, Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and Enterprise. Now, if you've watched any of those 5 Star Trek TV series, you've certainly seen plenty of life. Here are some examples. We have our regular bloodworm in the top left, our SETI eel, a very disturbing one in the top right. At the bottom we have a Targ, we have a Cardassian vole, we have our Gorn, and our old-style Klingon here. Now, while we tend to focus on life like this, we tend to ignore what's often present in the background, which is that there's a lot of plant life in addition to the animal life. In fact, there's a lot of trees specifically that look just like the trees that we have on Earth in all 4 quadrants of the Milky Way. See them on Kronos, on the Founder's homeworld, Bajor, Ocampa, etc. Now, it's interesting how much this plant life is ignored. I'll give you one example from the series itself, from the original series. This is the episode Who Mourns for Adone. As this image is shown on the view screen and on the top, Spock says, "Sensors indicate no life forms." Now, if you look at the planet depicted there, you see these big green splotches on the continents that are almost certainly plants. And from the beam insight, you see that there are trees there. So it's amusing that plant life is kind of dismissed as not really counting as life forms. Anyway, I'm not here to nitpick the Star Trek series, but let's think about what life in outer space could look like. So the first prediction, I'm going to go through a few predictions about what life in outer space should look like. The first prediction is that we should see greater diversity of life across the galaxy in Star Trek than exclusively what is seen on Earth. The galaxy is a big place. We should expect that there should be a lot more diversity of life than what we see just on our single planet. Now, this is especially true because, in fact, all life on Earth has a single origin. This is from the Star Trek episode All Good Things. There is one single origin of life about 3.8 billion years ago, and that leads to all the diversity of life we see on our planet today. And there's tons of evidence for this. So we humans are related to each other. We are related to other primates. We are related to other animals. And we're related to other kingdoms of life on our planet. So when we talk about what life needs, we're actually inferring from a sample size of one origin. It's, to put an analogy, it's like asking what sports people like by asking people who are just in one family only, right? So what are the characteristics of life that we know from this single origin? Well, there's a couple of bases of life on Earth that seem to be fairly abundant. All life on Earth is water-based. Okay? All life on Earth is carbon-based, and carbon is the basis for carbohydrates, fats, proteins, DNA, RNA, all those building blocks of life. Life today exists at this temperature between minus 88 Celsius and positive 58 Celsius. I should note that this differs from the time when life first arose, 3.8 billion years ago. It was quite a bit hotter on the planet, but this is what we see today. And many forms breathe oxygen. So I'd like to go through these in order and see if these are predictions we should expect for life off of Earth as well as on Earth. Now, in terms of the first one, water, the search for extraterrestrial life that is being conducted now focuses on what's referred to as water's Goldilocks zone. By the Goldilocks zone is referring to it being not too hot for liquid water and not too cold for liquid water. But why do we care about water? What's so important about water in particular? Well, water as a liquid is wonderful in many respects for allowing chemical reactions to proceed. And we need chemical reactions for life. Well, first, it's liquid at a broad range of temperatures. It's a great solvent in that it can dissolve lots of different chemicals. It's wonderful at accommodating charged particles to make reactions easy. Amazingly, trace amounts of water will speed up chemical reactions that have hydrogen by trillions of times. Trillions of times. And finally, it's a very simple compound. It has 2 elements, hydrogen and oxygen. Hydrogen is the most abundant element in the universe, and oxygen is the 3rd most abundant element in the universe. So it seems like this is a very easy solvent to have chemical reactions in general and life in particular occur. In case you're curious what the 2nd most abundant element in the universe is, that's helium. But helium is non-reactive, so that's actually not very useful for life. Are there alternatives to water-based life? Well, sure. There are other solvents out there which can allow chemical reactions to proceed. So here are a few examples: chloroform, liquid ammonia, ether, kerosene, very high pressure liquid methane, or very high pressure carbon dioxide. I put asterisks there to indicate the very high pressure ones. So these are other sorts of solvents that can allow chemical reactions to proceed and potentially could be associated with something akin to life. Now, the problems with these are that if you look at them, they tend to be complex, they tend to need special conditions, and generally speaking, they're not the most abundant elements in the universe. So water is the perfect solvent for chemical reactions in many respects, especially those that are going to be associated with life. And in looking for extraterrestrial life, it makes sense to look for water. So check mark on that. Now, the next element of life I mentioned was carbon. So why is carbon important? Well, carbon is very abundant on Earth. It's a very simple and small element, and it's versatile in that it can make these complex long-chain molecules that are the ones that we see associated with, for example, our proteins, our DNA, etc. Now, if you think about the periodic table of elements, you might remember that silicon is in the same column as carbon. And Star Trek has seized on this. For example, the Horde, as you see down there from the episode The Devil in the Dark, is silicon-based. Now, it's possible that you could have silicon-based life, but I would argue it's a little bit less probable. And a simple way of thinking about it is thinking about what happens when you combine either of those two elements with oxygen. Carbon dioxide, okay, this is something that I mentioned already as a good solvent, and it's gas, it's very flexible. Silicon dioxide, that is sand. Not so good for chemical reactions, definitely doesn't work as a solvent. So in that sense, silicon could be associated with life, but it's a little bit less probable. Now, there was a 2016 study which showed that you can incorporate silicon into hydrocarbons in some organisms, but that's still pretty far from silicon-based life. So how has Star Trek considered alternative forms of life? Well, certainly they have thought about life beyond carbon or water-based. So we have the Horda, the Excalbians, they are silicon-based. We have our Tholian, which seems to be mineral-based, so that's good. We have non-corporeal forms of life in Star Trek, such as the Organians, though they previously were corporeal, but now are not. Paxans and Medusan. So that, again, that's pretty broad. And we have these other forms which are pretty unclear because they change form. So we have our changelings, our skin of evil, and of course, Cube. So generally speaking, yes, Star Trek has done a great job considering alternative forms of life, and it's been potentially more creative than the search for extraterrestrial life in that it's going beyond what we see on Earth. So that's all excellent. What about temperature? Now again, not all species, even on Earth, actually expect or need room temperature of 22 Celsius, 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So the Pyrococcus that I have depicted here grows best at 100 degrees Celsius. And in fact, that's not the organism that lives at the highest temperatures. We have found some in the past that actually exist at 121 degrees Celsius and are able to reproduce at those high temperatures. So this is something we're seeing on Earth. We're seeing some extremophiles here. At the other extreme, the Methanogenium down there, that actually will not grow at 20 degrees Celsius. It needs to be at cold temperatures. And the bottom one there, that bacteria at the very bottom, actually survived being frozen for 120,000 years. Right? So that's pretty extreme. Now, do we see these sorts of extremophiles in Star Trek? In fact, we do, both at high and low temperatures. So we have the Tholians, which seem to require 200 Celsius or higher, and that's great. It's more extreme than we see on Earth. The Silver Blood, which was on the Demon planet in Voyager, it wants 200 Celsius. And in terms of cold ones, we have a space-dwelling species in Voyager. Clearly, it's cold there. And there's an implication that the Breen need a cold temperature based on their refrigeration suits, though there was some discussion that may not be the case in the series. So generally speaking, again, Star Trek is very good at considering a broader range of temperatures for life than what we see on Earth. What about oxygen? Well, again, there are some species on Earth which don't need oxygen. So this is true both for bacteria, and there's even one animal depicted there on the bottom, the Loriciferan, which supposedly does not need oxygen for reproduction or for living. And in fact, in Star Trek, we see the same thing. We have some species that don't need oxygen, such as the Axanar, which the nitrogen methane breathing, and Benzite, which has this breathing apparatus. We're not sure exactly what he breathes, but it's a little different. So again, we see at least as much diversity in the Star Trek universe as what we see on Earth. So again, the writers did a very good job here. Generally speaking, I'll give a thumbs up that in terms of our prediction of greater diversity of life characteristics across the galaxy in Star Trek than on Earth, This has been upheld, and this shows creative out-of-the-box thinking. So kudos to the Star Trek writers on this. Our second prediction is that some aspects of extraterrestrial life may match what we see on Earth, but the details of even those parts that match what we see on Earth should actually be quite different. So let's look at this in a little bit more depth and talk about how evolution happens more generally. So isolated populations on Earth are ones that tend to evolve differences. The reason for this is that isolated populations are part of distinct gene pools. So people in a gene pool or individuals in a gene pool will exchange genes, and that keeps them all very similar. You can think of it like swirling around some paint, right? If you swirl around paint, things tend to look pretty homogeneous. If you're swirling around paint in two different buckets, the two buckets won't necessarily look anything like each other, but within a bucket, it'll be pretty homogeneous. And this is one of the reasons why Australian animals, for example, tend to look quite different from animals on a lot of other continents. They've been isolated for a very long time. Now, this happens between species, but even within species. So, for example, the differences, the facial features and coloration associated with various human ethnic groups evolved within the last 100,000 years. And again, this was because these human ethnic groups were traditionally geographically isolated from each other. Now, what causes these differences to evolve while different populations are isolated from each other? Well, natural selection is definitely a driving force for this, and this is something that, of course, Charles Darwin is famous for advocating. Now, imagine you're starting with a population of brown bears, okay? And let's say these brown bears happen to be living in a snowy environment. And let's say that a random mutation arises which changes the fur coat color to white. Well, in this snowy environment, this mutation to white would actually have an advantage, right? Because this white bear could actually blend in with the snow, and it may be able to catch more reindeer by surprising them, or may be able to avoid predators if it has any. If this happens, then the bears that have this mutation will have more kids, and they'll pass on the mutation to their kids. So the mutation then becomes more abundant in the next generation as the bears get more food and have more kids. As a result of this, eventually the whole population will be white, because each iteration you'll have fewer and fewer of the brown bears, more and more of the white bears. So evolution by natural selection, although described often as a theory, it's in fact a mathematical inevitability. There's no way to avoid having evolution by natural selection if you have hereditary variation that affects your ability to survive or reproduce. So this is evolution by natural selection. Now, natural selection can cause convergence or a similarity in phenotype in very distantly related species. Right? So if you look, for example, at a shark and a dolphin, you see that there's a decent number of similarities between them, even though the dolphin is a mammal and the shark is a fish. They look kind of similar, but they're not identical. So you see the same sort of thing with the flying squirrel, the sugar glider, or the puffin, which lives in the north, and the penguin, which lives in the south. Again, they evolve some similarities because they live in fairly similar environments and experience similar conditions, but they're not identical. And importantly, very strong convergence is less likely as species are more distantly related. So, for example, if you put humans and grass in similar environments, we're not going to evolve to look similarly to each other. Okay? Now, let's think about this in the context of Star Trek. Here are a lot of Star Trek species as compared with our human, Jean-Luc Picard. And as you see, these all look pretty darn similar. There's some subtle differences. The Bajoran there at the top has some nose creases. The Ocampans have that fold of skin around the ear. The Betazoid have black irises in the skin. The Orion has green skin. Elorian, Guinan there, as far as we can tell, she's identical to a human. This is a little bit unexpected. And in fact, this is almost certainly too similar to be explained by simple convergence. Now, the Star Trek writers realized this was a problem, so they introduced an episode to address this. The episode that tried to explain this was in The Next Generation, the episode called The Chase. We have this person here, which I'll call her the originator, that she's standing to the left of everybody else, and she says, "Life evolved in my planet before all others in this part of the galaxy. We left our world, explored the stars, and found none like ourselves. The seed codes directed your evolution toward a physical form resembling ours." So this person, I'll call her the originator, she and her species designed what people were eventually going to look like billions of years later, as well as all these other species. Now, this is loosely based on a concept called panspermia. Panspermia is the theory that life on Earth originated from precursors of life in outer space, that then initiated life when it reached suitable conditions. So in theory, 4 billion years ago, this happened on Earth and on these other planets based on Star Trek. So let's think about this. Let's think about what happened over the course of the last 4 billion years, first on Earth. So here we have, on the left, we have the geologic eras that are known, or eons that are known from our planet. So the earliest forms of life that we know of are about 3.8 billion years ago. Timing is pretty good in terms of what it says with Star Trek. We have the origin of the mitochondria, which is the powerhouse of the cell for a lot of animal, plant, and fungal life. That originated 1.5 to 1.8 billion years ago. The first chloroplasts, which allow photosynthesis in plants, this happened about 1.2 billion years ago. Animals, around 1 billion years ago. Vertebrates around 500 million years ago. Now, importantly, I'd like to point out these things here. We have a couple of mass extinctions that happened. This one right here got rid of 70% of terrestrial vertebrates as well as 96% of marine species. And this happened about 250 million years ago. Then we had our dinosaurs and mammals evolve. And then we had this other extinction, which killed off about 80% of animal species, and that's the one that got rid of course, the dinosaurs. And eventually, after that, we had our primates and modern humans. So there's been a lot of change. There's been a lot of change over these 4 billion years, and a lot of life resulting from that change. I'll come back to the extinctions in just a moment. But let's look at the tree of life on Earth as it is today. So this is a nice depiction of the tree of life. The center indicates the origin of life, and as you get further from the center, the distance from the center is when these different forms existed. So I'd like to zoom in on different parts here, and let's think about the implications of what the originator was saying there. So here, we're looking over here just at the origins of mammals and birds, things like that. So the first primates you can see were about 60-some billion years ago. They'd be over around here with the common ancestor of the tree shrews, lemurs, etc., down to humans. So they'll be around there. The first mammals are about 220 million years ago. Note that as you get to the common ancestor further back, you're rotating left on the arc, and you're looking much more different. Obviously, we look more like other mammals than we do like birds or reptiles. We see the first vertebrates, the origin of all fish, reptiles, birds, and mammals, about 500 million years ago, over around here. We go further back, between 1 and 2 billion years ago, we see the common ancestors of us with fungi and with plants, and then all the way back to 3.8 billion years ago, the common ancestors of all life. Okay, so with roughly that same common ancestor of all life, so this is us to bacteria, plants, fungi, etc., things like that. We're saying that we have the same similarity, or actually less similarity, to Vulcans and Klingons as to these other things. So basically, what this means is you are literally more closely related to grass than you are to a Vulcan or a Klingon, right? You're way, way, way more closely related to a starfish, than you are to a Vulcan or a Klingon. That seems to be a little bit of a stretch. That's probably more extreme than can be caused by convergence. So let's think about this even more deeply. The steps to this, here's 4 billion years ago, the originators, they were seeding life on all these different planets. They did it maybe on at least 5, which evolved humanoids, because we saw humans, Cardassians, Klingons, Romulans, and the one planet with the archaeological remains in that episode. Okay? So 4 billion years ago, they seeded life. They then had to plan for the mass extinction events to kill off the reptiles. So maybe they aimed some asteroids at those planets to hit there 3.4 billion years later to cut back on the reptiles. And all of this was encoded in bits of DNA 4 billion years ago that were unmodified or unmutated over that time. Right? The only random elements to change were subtleties of color and face shape as depicted by all these people. So we can actually test this mathematically. So here are some very conservative estimates for everything. Let's say that for the first 1.5 billion years that all these species existed as microbes, let's say there were 100 cell divisions per year, a mutation rate of 10 to the minus 10. This is actually a very conservative mutation rate. The probability that any one DNA element would not change is about 1 in 3 million, or 3 times 10 to the minus 7. So another way to put this is, no way. Basically, this is a stretch that extraterrestrial life in Star Trek is arguably way too similar to Earth's life. Still love seeing it, but it's probably not accurate. Now, there's an alternate hypothesis introduced in one episode. So, in the episode Return to Tomorrow, Sargon, who is in that ball of light there, says, "It's possible you are our descendants, Captain Kirk. 6,000 centuries ago, our vessels were colonizing this galaxy. Perhaps our own legends of an Adam and Eve were 2 of our travelers." Now, this actually works pretty well because this timing of 600,000 years ago is consistent with Homo erectus on Earth. And if you look at physical similarity between us to Homo erectus versus us to Vulcans, Klingons, etc., that would actually make pretty good sense. So this is good in that it's explaining the similarity among human-like species in space. However, as Dr. Ann Mulhall, who's standing there, actually pointed out in the episode, it's bad because it implies that humans on Earth are unrelated to other Earth animals. And there's so much evidence that we are related to other Earth animals, not just other primates, but all life on Earth. So in general, this probably doesn't work. Now, Spock suggested this may be okay for Vulcan prehistory, however, so maybe it applies to some planets, but not to others. So that's the end for this part. The third question is interspecies reproduction possible with life from other planets? This is something people love to think about. So the first question that we need to answer to look at this is, what is a species? Again, a species is generally defined as people, or as individuals within a single gene pool. So for example, you have this herd of horses, they're a single gene pool, they're probably all the same species. And if generally speaking, this population of horses interbreeds with other populations of horses, they're probably all the same species. Generally speaking, individuals of the same species have the opportunity to reproduce with each other, are generally willing to reproduce with each other, and give hybrids that are living and fertile. So an example of a contrast to that is, of course, the hybrid of the horse and donkey, which is a mule. This hybrid is sterile. It's incapable of reproducing. Therefore, horses and donkeys are considered to be separate species. So, fair enough. Now, the occasional hybrid is formed between species. There is the occasional oops between species. In fact, 25% of plant species that we know and 10% of animal species we know occasionally will mate with another species. And this is not something restricted to non-primates. In fact, humans and Neanderthals actually interbred not that long ago, probably about 50,000 years ago. In fact, if you look at people today, or in the slight future, such as Picard or yourself, generally speaking, Europeans have 1 to 4% of their DNA that originated from Neanderthals and came into the human population from matings with Neanderthals. There's a little bit less Neanderthal DNA in Africans and Middle Easterners, but there definitely is a good amount in Europeans. So this does happen. Let me stress that you can be different species and still make hybrids. Now, in fact, the oldest known animal or plant split with hybrid offspring is from a pair of ferns that are diverged about 60 million years ago. So there's a picture of this fern here. To give you some idea of what that divergence time is, that is comparable to human to tarsier. Probably don't really imagine those two hybridizing with each other, or at least I hope not. Just about all other known hybrids are from species that are much more recently diverged here on Earth. So what does this mean in the context of what we saw from The Chase? Well, if interbreeding between humanoids happens in Star Trek based on The Chase, that divergence time is more than 66 times longer than the longest we've ever seen on Earth. So I wouldn't go so far as to say it's impossible, but that seems extremely unlikely. Now, how much hybridization do we see in Star Trek? In fact, we see kind of a lot of hybridization there. We see it. There are some examples from Romulan, Ocampan, Betazoid, Klingon, Vulcan, Katarian. In each of these cases, the opportunity arose. The parents were willing. In some cases, there are some identified medical intervention that happened to make it work. And the hybrids are viable. And at least in some cases, the hybrids are even sterile. We know the Klingon-human hybrid is, in fact, fertile in this case. So I would say this is arguably way too much hybridization with humans, more so than is possible based on what we know about evolutionary biology. So these are the 3 predictions I wanted to go over. I just have a little bonus piece I wanted to close out with. This bonus question is, are relations among extraterrestrial species realistic based on what we see from Earth? This chart shows you the genetic similarity both within and between species with a few examples. If you were to grab 2 random humans, they're more than 99% similar at the DNA sequence level. Human to chimps, 98.7%. Chimp to bonobo, 99.6%. There's some fruit fly species that have a lot of variation within them where, some individuals are maybe 98% similar within species. So this gives you some idea of what you expect to see. Now, there was one fairly extreme example I'd like to comment upon from Star Trek Enterprise. That's the Xindi species. These are supposedly more than 99.5% similar. However, when we look at them, the differences that are recapitulated match what's seen on Earth for species that are millions of years divergent. So humanoid to whale is 100 million years divergent. Humanoid to reptile is more than 300 million years divergent. Humanoid to insects is more than 500 million years divergent. So saying that these are all 99.5% similar, all I can say is maybe things work differently on this indie homeworld than what we see on Earth today. But I just wanted to comment on that one little fun piece. So let me give you a couple of punchlines. Generally speaking, Star Trek admirably considers what life in outer space could look like, and does appropriately emphasize likely forms. So we do see the water-based, a lot of carbon-based, and some thinking outside the box from those things as well. Star Trek does suggest reasons why there's so many humanoids across the galaxy, but I have to say the rationales are probably improbable. And generally speaking, there's way too much interspecies mating in Star Trek, though some people may like that. So just a thank you for watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed it. Take care.